I'm Emily Maddox, 36 years old, a soldier, a daughter, and still the outsider in my own family. At every holiday table, my brother's promotions and my cousin's new cars were toasted with pride, while my presence barely earned a nod. My mother's smiles were never soft, they were sharp, precise, meant to remind me I didn't measure up. Then came the email and invitation to Thanksgiving. Just 2 clipped sentences, more duty than affection. I stared at it for days before I answered, and even as I pulled into the driveway of the house where I grew up, I felt it in my bones. This wasn't homecoming. It was an ambush dressed up as tradition. Ever been erased from your own story? Hit like if you've ever been the invisible one at your own table. Comment if someone's pride ever made you feel small. It started that night, with a front door swinging open and my mother's eyes scanning me like I was an intruder. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, a short email from her mother written in clipped sentences, as if it were more of a formality than a genuine request. Emily had stared at the words for a long time before agreeing. Now, as she pulled into the driveway of the suburban house where she had grown up, she felt the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. The windows glowed with golden light, laughter spilled into the chilly November evening, and she wondered if she was walking straight into an ambush disguised as family tradition. Her mother's words from long ago drifted back, "I'll always support your choices, sweetheart." They rang hollow now, echoing against the tension in her chest. The woman who had spoken them no longer seemed to exist. What waited inside was Margaret, a matriarch armed with sharp opinions and sharper expectations. Emily smoothed the wrinkles from her jacket before stepping out of the car. She had chosen to travel light, carrying only a modest bottle of wine. The glass fogged slightly in the cold air as she held it, a token gesture that already felt inadequate compared to the expensive vintages her relatives would be flaunting inside. She rang the bell. The door opened, releasing a wave of warmth mixed with the aromas of roasted turkey, butter, and cinnamon. Her mother's eyes flicked over her with the precision of a scanner. "At least you made it," Margaret said, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Busy doing what exactly?" Emily forced her own smile, tight and brittle. "Life, Mom, just life." She stepped inside, placing the wine on the crowded table by the entrance. No one commented on it. Richard, her father, offered a polite nod from the living room couch. He didn't rise, didn't speak. He rarely did. His silence was a kind of armor, and Emily never knew whether he used it to protect himself or to abandon her. The cousins filled the dining room, voices overlapping in a competition of successes, job promotions, vacations, new cars. Bradley, sleek in a tailored suit despite the casual holiday, was already bragging about his latest business deal. Sophie slipped through the crowd to greet her. "Aunt Emily!" The girl's eyes lit up as she hugged her, oblivious to the dismissive glances circling around them. "I told my friends you were a soldier. That's so cool." Emily knelt to meet her niece's gaze, heart softening. "It's not always cool, kiddo, but thank you." The contrast stung Sophie's admiration like a small flame in a room full of shadows. Emily carried it with her to the dinner table, where she found her seat near the edge, half in the conversation and half out. The table gleamed with crystal glasses and polished silverware, but beneath the shine lay an undercurrent of judgment. As the meal unfolded, Margaret's remarks continued like tiny daggers wrapped in politeness. "You still renting?" At your age, Bradley had already bought his first condo. Or, "It's good you're here. Holidays are about family after all, even if some of us are busier than others." Each word landed with deliberate precision, designed to remind Emily of her supposed shortcomings. Emily chewed her food slowly, her jaw tight. She kept her jacket on despite the warmth of the house, ignoring subtle comments about manners. The fabric felt like armor, concealing more than just her fatigue. Then Aunt Linda, rosy-cheeked from wine, leaned forward with a laugh. "So tell me, Emily, do you even have a real career now? Or are you just floating around?" The table quieted, eyes shifting toward her. Forks hovered mid-air. Heat rose to Emily's face, a flush she couldn't control. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth, the stories, the battles, none of it would matter to them. To this family, her absence from the ladder of conventional success was a failure. The bottle of wine she had brought sat unopened, forgotten among the grander labels. Her throat tightened as she looked down at her plate, turkey and cranberries blurring together. Sophie's small hand touched hers under the table, a silent gesture of loyalty that nearly broke her resolve. Emily swallowed her pride and whispered to herself, "Not tonight. Nothing stings quite like a promise you once believed." The words pressed against Emily's chest as she sat among the laughter and chatter, staring at the flickering candlelight that made the dining room seem warmer than it felt. Outside, the November wind rattled bare branches, but in here the air was thick with roasted turkey, buttery potatoes, and the subtle perfume of wine glasses being tipped too often. She adjusted her jacket again, ignoring the warmth of the house. No one asked why she kept it on. No one cared. The conversation had shifted smoothly from family anecdotes to careers and finances, as if everyone had silently agreed that the worth of a person could be measured in promotions and paychecks. Bradley, polished and smug, was recounting the closing of a real estate deal worth millions. Richard nodded absent-mindedly, while Margaret leaned forward, eyes glowing with pride that belonged to someone else's accomplishments. Across the table, Darren leaned back in his chair, his voice loud enough to draw the whole room's attention. "Some of us didn't waste our 20s, he announced, smirking as he dangled his car keys in the candlelight. "Just bought a brand new Jaguar. Black, leather interior, all the bells and whistles. Worth every cent." The cousins erupted in approval, clinking glasses. Darren's grin widened as he added, "Not everyone can say they invested wisely. But hey, some people chose other paths." His eyes slid toward Emily, the pause deliberate. Emily's grip on her glass tightened. She forced her lips into a small, indifferent smile, though her jaw ached with the effort. She felt the old promise again, the one her mother had once whispered when she chose to enlist. "I'll always support your choices, sweetheart." That promise had carried her through nights, under foreign skies, through gunfire and dust, through the quiet fear that she might never make it home. And here, in the glow of this dining room, it had curdled into disdain. Margaret lifted her wine, swirling it with unnecessary flourish. "I actually wrote a piece last year," she said, her voice sliding easily into the room. "It was about this mysterious veteran they called the Ghost Commander. No one really knew her story. She floated through the system, never leaving much of a trace. A fascinating case of wasted potential." Emily froze. Her fork hovered over her plate. The title hit her like shrapnel, The Ghost Commander. She had read the article in secret, knowing immediately who Margaret had been describing, even though the name was absent. Now, to hear it spoken aloud, in this space, was to feel herself erased and exposed at once. Sophie shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing something without understanding. Richard's silence remained unbroken, his eyes fixed on his plate. Bradley raised a brow but said nothing. Darren leaned in, seizing the moment. "Sounds familiar, Aunt Margaret," he said with a cruel grin. "Floating around without a plan, living off scraps of glory. Almost like—" His gaze burned across the table. Emily inhaled, slow and deliberate, her chest tight. The words she wanted to say about discipline, sacrifice, survival burned at the back of her throat. But they remained locked inside. Then Margaret laughed, not softly, not kindly, but with the sharp edge of ridicule. "You were supposed to study law," she said, shaking her head, as if the whole affair were a tragic joke. "Not play soldier. Imagine where you'd be now if you had listened." The table erupted into chuckles, polite nods, and the occasional sympathetic tis-ki. For them, it was casual commentary, a topic of dinner conversation. For Emily, it was a blade twisted into old wounds. Her hand trembled as she reached for her fork again. Just then, a pop cracked outside someone lighting early fireworks in the neighborhood. The sound sliced through the window, sharp and sudden. Emily flinched, the metal fork scraping her plate with a shrill ring. No one else reacted. Only she felt her pulse surge, memories pressing against her vision like a storm waiting to break. She gripped her fork tighter, knuckles white, resisting the urge to speak. The war never really ends. It just waits for you in silence. Emily stared at her plate, her fork balanced between her fingers as the voices around her dimmed into muffled echoes. Darren's smug voice lingered in her ears. "Some of us didn't waste our 20s. The words became a fuse, burning back through years and oceans, into another night when laughter was a sound she could not imagine, when silence meant waiting for bullets to break it. The dining room blurred. The scent of roasted turkey dissolved into acrid smoke and dust. Candles flickered, then twisted into flashes of muzzle fire. Emily's chest tightened. She was no longer in New Jersey, but back in the cracked streets of Deir ez-Zor, 2017. The night had been suffocating, heat clinging to the air even after the sun had gone. Shadows stretched across the rubble, every corner threatening movement. Then the world cracked open, the shriek of bullets slicing through stone, the percussion of explosions rolling like thunder. She remembered the chaos men shouting, radios sputtering, the metallic tang of blood already too close. "Stay down, Maddox," the lieutenant barked, but Emily's eyes were fixed on two comrades pinned under the shattered skeleton of a collapsed wall. The gunfire stitched the air above them, sparks biting at the sandbags. Their screams cut through the chaos, raw and terrified. Her hands moved before orders could chain her. She sprinted, boots pounding through dust, dodging bursts of fire that spat sparks from concrete. A bullet grazed her shoulder, the sting hot and sharp, but she pushed forward. She heaved at the rubble, muscles screaming, pulling one soldier free, then dragging the other by his vest. The night was a storm, but she refused to yield. Beside her, Mason appeared, her closest comrade, the man who had carried jokes into every march, who had kept them human in inhuman places. He fired back into the dark, covering her, his voice hoarse as he shouted, "Move, Emily! Don't you stop!" She remembered his face illuminated by a flare, the fierce determination, the unshakable grin that dared the night to swallow him. And then the shot. One clean, merciless sound. Mason staggered, blood blooming against his chest. His rifle clattered to the ground as he collapsed into her arms. She pressed against the wound, screaming his name, but his gaze already drifted past her, fixed on some horizon she could not see. His breath rattled, shallow, each word a knife in her heart. "You'll live," he whispered, his hand trembling against hers. "For us." The chaos swallowed his voice, but the words etched themselves into her bones. Even as she pulled the wounded to safety, even as her hands shook with exhaustion, Mason's final command weighed heavier than any weapon she had ever carried. "For us." Her chest heaved as the battlefield dissolved. The laughter of family returned, harsh and jarring, cutting into her ears like shrapnel. She blinked and saw the table again, candles, wine, the roast carved neatly, faces smiling as if none of it had happened, as if her scars belonged to another world. Margaret's glare found her across the table, sharp and suspicious. "Are you even listening?" she asked, her tone laced with judgment. Emily straightened, her hand still trembling against her fork, her throat raw with unsaid words. She forced a breath, steadying herself, but the weight of Mason's last words pressed deeper. Then, soft and curious, Sophie leaned closer. Her small voice broke through the noise of dismissal and disdain. "Aunt Emily," she whispered, eyes wide with wonder. "Your jacket, it's shining. You're not family when money speaks louder than blood." Emily dabbed her mouth with a napkin as the plates of turkey and stuffing were cleared away, replaced with gleaming desserts, pumpkin pie crowned with cream, pecan tartlets still warm, and coffee that filled the room with roasted bitterness. The clinking of silverware softened into an air of expectancy, a different kind of hunger filling the space. She sensed it before anyone spoke, the tension curdling in the air like milk gone sour. Sophie's innocent comment about her jacket still hovered in Emily's mind, an echo of light in an otherwise shadowed evening. But now, the warmth in the child's voice seemed like a fragile candle against the chill of what was to come. Aunt Linda, who had sat prim and composed throughout dinner, finally cleared her throat. She placed her dessert fork down with deliberate grace, and in that pause, the table seemed to tighten. Her voice carried the authority of someone who believed in order above all else. "Since we're all gathered, it's time to be transparent about the estate matters. Your grandparents wanted fairness, and I think tonight is appropriate to discuss their wishes." The chatter faded. Even Sophie, sensing the shift, leaned closer to her mother. Emily glanced around the table and saw it immediately, the spark of greed flickering in eyes that only moments ago glistened with holiday civility. Margaret sat taller, Bradley smirked as though already assured of his peace, and Darren leaned back with that cocky posture that came from a man who had never known denial. Linda unfolded a set of papers from her handbag, each crease sharp, as though the inheritance had been folded and refolded in secrecy for years. Richard, Margaret, Bradley, Darren. Her eyes lingered on each name as she announced the allocations. Properties, trust funds, bonds, the legacies carved into slices of fortune. Smiles widened with each designation, forks tapping pie crusts like the rhythm of victory. Emily waited, her chest tight, but her face unreadable. She had no expectations yet. A thread of hope lingered, faint and foolish, that perhaps her years of absence, of sacrifice, had not severed her place entirely. But Linda's voice moved on, steady, impersonal, closing with a neat finality. "That concludes the list." A silence stretched. Emily blinked, her name unspoken. erased with clinical precision. Her wineglass trembled slightly against the table. Darren leaned forward, the glow of triumph painting his grin. Guess that's it then. Makes sense, doesn't it? He glanced at her with mock sympathy. I mean, some of us built careers, homes, lives. Some of us didn't waste our years chasing dust in foreign deserts. Bradley chuckled, his fork slicing through pecan pie. Honestly, Emily, you wouldn't know what to do with responsibility anyway. Better the estate goes to those who can handle it. Their laughter mingled, rich and cruel, the sweetness of dessert clashing with the bitterness swelling in Emily's throat. She stayed silent, her lips pressed tight, her pulse hammered, but she offered no rebuttal. She had stared down men with rifles, watched lives evaporate in seconds. She would not spill her pain for them to feed upon. And yet, the silence her armor was twisted by them into weakness. She could see it in the smug curl of Bradley's lip, in Darren's lazy shake of his head. To them, her restraint was proof she didn't belong. The room seemed to shrink, voices pressing closer, air thinning. Margaret's face was flushed with a satisfaction she barely concealed, as if her daughter's erasure had validated her years of disdain. She leaned toward Richard, lips pursed, but he shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around his glass. His eyes darted toward Emily, something unsaid flickering in the depths guilt, maybe even a glimmer of defense. For the first time all night, Richard opened his mouth. Perhaps, but before the word could breathe, Margaret's gaze slashed toward him, sharp as a knife. Richard, she said, her voice low and final. Don't. The room held its breath as his mouth snapped shut, the unsaid words collapsing into silence. The smallest spark can ignite an entire storm. The dining table had dissolved into fragments of laughter and whispered judgments, the remains of dessert clinging to porcelain like an afterthought. The family dispersed in waves, some carrying their glasses into the living room where football flickered on the television, others sinking deeper into wine and gossip at the edge of the kitchen island. Emily lingered in the in-between, her chair angled slightly toward the doorway, her jacket still drawn tightly across her shoulders despite the warmth of the house. The noise of the house blurred into a dull hum. She thought of slipping out quietly, avoiding another barrage of questions, but Sophie appeared at her side like a shadow, small fingers tugging gently at her sleeve. The girl's eyes were curious, innocent, untainted by the barbed tone of the adults. What's inside your jacket pocket? Sophie whispered, voice barely higher than the clinking of glassware. Her tiny hand brushed against the outline of the case beneath Emily's arm. Emily exhaled slowly, bending slightly to meet her gaze. The corners of her mouth lifted in a tired smile, not one of mockery but of tenderness. Just something I keep close, she murmured, careful, almost protective. Her voice carried the weight of years Sophie could not understand, yet it softened like a lullaby meant to hush away questions. The girl nodded, accepting the answer without suspicion, before bouncing back toward the staircase, her laughter trailing behind. For a moment, Emily let herself breathe. Children had a way of asking without judgment, of reminding you of what mattered beyond the masks adults wore. Richard's presence startled her. She hadn't noticed him remain behind. He stood by the archway, leading into the living room, glass in hand, his face partly obscured by shadow. The years had carved lines into him, weariness, restraint, perhaps regret, but his eyes were sharper than she remembered, watchful in their silence. Emily adjusted her coat, tugging it more securely around her shoulders as she shifted in her seat. The movement was subtle, but it dislodged the fabric just enough for a corner of the velvet blue case to peek through. Richard's gaze caught it immediately. His body stiffened, his glass lowering, as though gravity had taken hold too fast. For a fraction of a second, the carefully maintained mask of indifference cracked, replaced by recognition. His lips parted, but no words followed, only the flicker of something she had never expected to find in his eyes. Respect. Across the room, Margaret's voice rose above the muted television, sharp and dismissive as she retold an embellished version of Bradley's latest promotion. Bradley basked in it, one arm draped over the couch, his grin wide as he soaked in the applause. They hadn't noticed Richard falter, hadn't seen the silent exchange happening in the corner of the room. Emily kept her expression unreadable, but inside, her chest tightened. For years, her father's silence had been the deepest cut his failure to defend her, to stand between her and her mother's disdain. Yet here he was, eyes locked on the blue case as if it spoke truths louder than words ever could. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the warmth suffocating, the buzz of conversation dimming into a low throb in her ears. She shifted her glass to the table, her hand brushing against the case deliberately this time, claiming it not as something to be hidden, but something waiting. Richard's breath caught. He took a half step forward, then stopped, as though torn between the safety of silence and the danger of acknowledgement. Emily met his stare head-on, her voice so low it was almost carried away by the clatter of a wine bottle uncorked in the kitchen. "Not yet," she whispered, the words threaded with steel and patience. And in that fragile pause, with the storm still cloaked in velvet, Richard understood he was not her judge tonight, but her witness. Sometimes betrayal isn't shouted, it's printed in black ink. The house had settled into a quieter rhythm after dinner, though the walls still carried faint echoes of laughter, glasses clinking, the television droning in the distance. Emily found herself summoned to the study Aunt Linda's domain, where the air felt heavier, the scent of old paper and polish lingering as if the room had soaked up every secret ever spoken inside it. The mahogany desk stood at the center, its surface crowded with neatly stacked folders and papers. A brass lamp cast a golden pool of light that made the documents glow with undue importance. Emily sat across from Aunt Linda, who adjusted her reading glasses with the gravity of a judge about to deliver a sentence. Margaret stood to the side, arms crossed, her expression smugly satisfied. Richard lingered near the door, silent as always, his hands clasped behind his back. "Emily," Aunt Linda began, her tone carrying a veneer of gentleness that did nothing to soften the words. "You know the estate had to be divided fairly. Bradley, Darren, Sophie's trust. Everyone has been provided for in a way that secures their futures." She shuffled a few papers, as though the act of touching them legitimized what she was about to say. "Given your unique circumstances, it was decided you wouldn't require the same provisions." The words struck harder than any raised voice could. "Unique circumstances," Emily repeated under her breath. Her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair, her jaw tightening with the effort not to lash out. Margaret stepped forward, tilting her head with mock sympathy. "It's not personal, dear. You've made your choices. A soldier's path is it's honorable in its way. But estates are about stability, about contribution to the family's long-term prosperity." Emily let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing against her lungs, before she finally asked, her voice low but cutting, "And my years of service? Don't they count as legacy?" The room stilled for a fraction of a second. Aunt Linda looked down at her papers as if she hadn't heard. Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. Richard shifted near the door, his jaw clenching, his eyes flicking briefly toward Emily before falling to the floor. His silence was a wound deeper than Margaret's words. "Service doesn't pay the bills, Emily," Margaret said flatly, her tone sharpened to a blade. The words carried no room for debate, only dismissal, and their cruelty landed with the precision of something rehearsed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's breath caught, the urge to rise, to shout, to shake the papers off that desk pounding in her chest. But she remained seated, nails digging into the fabric of her sleeve beneath her jacket. The quiet resistance burned hotter than an outburst ever could. Her gaze drifted, unwilling to let Margaret's triumph be the only thing she saw. On the far wall, half hidden between shelves of leather-bound books, hung a framed newspaper article. The headline was familiar, though she hadn't expected to find it here, of all places. "The Ghost Commander, the enigma behind enemy lines." Her heart lurched. The photograph was cropped, blurry, taken during an operation never meant to be exposed. It had circulated years ago, speculation swirling about the unnamed soldier who had led a daring rescue mission under fire. Emily remembered the day it ran in print, her mother's byline beneath it. Margaret had written the story, proud of her mystery hero, yet she had never once acknowledged that the figure in the article was her own daughter. Emily's chest tightened, a bitter taste rising at the back of her throat. Betrayal here wasn't shouted across the table, it was institutionalized, etched into wills, sealed in articles that erased her name while stealing her story. She leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes fixed on that framed article, its presence louder than any of Margaret's words. For the first time all evening, her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not of joy, but of resolve. A single sentence can cut deeper than any blade. The living room glowed with the warmth of the fireplace, logs cracking and spitting embers as shadows danced across the polished mantel. Crystal glasses caught the flickering light, reflecting in shards of amber wine and tired eyes. The after-dinner lull had settled like a heavy blanket, but beneath it ran a current of sharpness quieter than dinner's open judgments, yet no less dangerous. Bradley leaned back in the armchair, his watch catching the firelight as if it deserved its own applause. Darren sprawled on the couch, legs crossed casually, grinning at his own jokes before they were even spoken. Margaret perched near the hearth, her posture perfectly composed, though her eyes flicked toward Emily now and again, as if to remind her of her precarious place. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug, her small figure glowing in the firelight, eyes darting between the adults like she was piecing together a puzzle too big for her age. The conversation ambled at first, the men boasting about investments, new ventures, cars, and properties. Then, like a sudden shift in the wind, Darren tilted his head toward Emily, his grin widening. "Maybe you should have stayed home and written poetry," he said, voice dripping with mockery. The words landed softly in tone, but sharply in intent, each syllable a sneer. Emily's hand tightened on the stem of her glass, but her face remained composed. She let the silence breathe for a beat, letting Darren's smirk stretch smugly before she responded. Then, calm as stone, her voice slipped into the room. "Funny. That's exactly what the Pentagon didn't say when they signed my contracts." The effect was instant. Darren's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, though he quickly pulled it back into place. Bradley chuckled, as if to dismiss the weight of her words, but the sound lacked conviction. Even Margaret shifted slightly, her shoulders stiffening, her lips pressing together in a tight line. The fire popped, throwing sparks upward. The silence that followed carried its own fire, charged and heavy. Sophie looked up from the rug, her young face lit with indignation. She broke the pause with a burst of words, her voice unfiltered, innocent, and fierce. "She saved people's lives." The sentence ripped through the room sharper than any adult could have delivered. It was pure, uncalculated truth. Margaret's hand twitched, as if she might hush the child, but Sophie's declaration hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. Darren scoffed loudly, leaning forward as if to reclaim ground. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "You make it sound like—" He stopped short, the smirk still curling his mouth, but his eyes betraying something else. For just an instant, the mask slipped, uncertainty flashing like a crack in glass. Emily caught it. She leaned back slightly, letting the faintest trace of a smile play on her lips, her silence now a weapon sharper than Darren's mockery. For the first time that evening, control had shifted not with raised voices, but with carefully measured words, and an ally's unguarded truth. The fire roared louder, or perhaps it only felt that way, as Darren's faltering smirk revealed what Emily had been waiting for, the first fracture in the facade. When they think you're weak, that's when they strike the hardest. The family drifted back toward the dining room as though the firelight in the living room had been too forgiving, too soft. Champagne flutes stood ready, already catching the overhead chandelier's glow. The air was different now, no longer the warmth of dinner, but the cool sharpness of a tribunal disguised as celebration. Emily sat at her original place, the faint taste of wine lingering in her mouth like ash. Every creak of chair legs against hardwood seemed exaggerated, marking the beginning of another round. Darren was the first to rise. His grin looked practiced, too rehearsed, as he lifted his glass high. "To the real breadwinners of this family," he declared, voice dripping with confidence, as though he expected laughter to echo after him. The champagne sparkled in his hand, each bubble bursting with a kind of arrogance that matched his smirk. Bradley leaned in, clinking his glass against Darren's with an eager laugh. "Hear, hear. Some of us managed to turn hard work into something tangible." His eyes slid toward Emily, the smirk widening. "Not everyone gets to coast along on, well, let's just call it non-existent income." The words landed heavy, each syllable honed to humiliate. Emily didn't flinch outwardly, though her fingers tightened against the base of her glass until the chilled stem dug into her palm. Her gaze drifted to the bubbles rising in her champagne, fragile, fleeting, like every bit of respect she once expected here. Margaret leaned forward, her voice smooth, almost pitying, but carrying the sting of sharpened steel. "She had potential once," she said, as though addressing the table more than Emily herself. "Bright, ambitious, sharp as a blade. Then she threw it away. All those years, for what?" Her pause stretched long enough to let the silence accuse. "For dust." Emily stared straight ahead, eyes unblinking, her breath steady. Inside, her pulse thudded like a war drum, the old rhythm of survival under fire. She recognized the tactic: overwhelm, isolate, corner the target until they broke. It was a battlefield in disguise, and every toast, every mocking glance was a bullet fired. The clink of cutlery snapped through the tension. Richard's fork slipped from his hand, clattering against his plate. The sound was loud enough to still the conversation for a breath. His face tightened, the faintest flicker of defiance showing through his otherwise stoic mask. Emily caught it, the subtle shift, the weight of words unspoken. But before he could let them out, Margaret's eyes cut across the table, sharp as a command. Richard froze, his lips pressed into a thin line, his silence folding over him like a cloak. The moment passed, but Emily's chest swelled with a quiet fire. They thought their words boxed her in, that silence was her surrender. But silence, she knew, could be sharper than any retort, if wielded properly. She lowered her gaze, fingers loosening slightly from the stem of her glass. Her lips curved, not a smile, but something colder, a whisper of the storm she carried. Leaning just enough for her words to ride the edge of the table's hum, she breathed them into the air. Careful, you don't know the half of it. The champagne bubbles popped softly in their glasses. But it was the silence that followed her words that carried the true weight, the silence of cracks forming where no one yet dared to look. The past has a way of burning through the present. Emily sat at the table, the fizz of champagne still soft in her glass, voices weaving around her like strands of barbed wire. Darren's laughter cracked louder than the others, his jokes stretching on, his smirk wide as though her quiet words from earlier had never happened. Bradley leaned in, egging him on, while Margaret presided at the head of the table, sipping her drink with the authority of someone who believed every word against Emily was truth carved in stone. But Emily barely heard them now. Their words blurred into a hum, distant, muffled, until even the clinking of glasses faded. A different sound rose instead, the metallic whine of shells overhead, the dull thud of boots hitting sand, the sharp crack of gunfire tearing through the night. Her mind was no longer seated at a polished table in New Jersey. It was crouched in the grit of Syria, smoke stinging her throat, the air trembling with fear and fire. "Fall back! That's an order!" someone had shouted, their voice breaking against the chaos. Emily's gaze cut through the smoke, past the shifting shadows of her platoon. Mason was down, his leg shredded by shrapnel, his body too far from cover. Blood soaked the dust beneath him, the kind of blood that spread too quickly. She didn't hesitate. Orders be damned. Her boots pounded against the rubble-strewn earth as bullets sliced the air around her. Every instinct screamed at her to get down, to turn back, but she reached Mason, her hands hooking under his arms. "Don't you dare quit on me!" she shouted, her voice ragged as mortar fire shook the ground. Mason coughed, a grin breaking through the pain. "You always were the stubborn one," he rasped. His eyes locked onto hers, fierce and fading at once. She dragged him toward the broken wall where two others crouched, their rifles jerking upward at each sound. Her muscles burned, but she pulled until they were behind cover. And then an explosion split the night. Mason's body jerked in her grip, his hand clutching at hers before it slackened. Dust and fire swallowed everything. His voice, faint, broke through just once more. "You'll live, for us." The words clung to her, more binding than the weight of his blood. And then silence except for the endless ringing in her ears. Emily blinked hard, her breath sharp, the dining room swimming back into view. The polished table, the flicker of candlelight, the faces of her family laughing at jokes that had nothing to do with survival. Darren threw his head back, laughter booming, the sound grotesque in its emptiness compared to the echoes still pounding in her skull. Her lips moved before she realized, her voice low, barely audible. "Mason!" Sophie's wide eyes darted to her, concern flickering on the young girl's face. "Aunt Emily?" she whispered, leaning closer, as if sensing that the storm inside Emily was far louder than the voices at the table. The sound of her name tethered Emily for a heartbeat. She forced herself still, trying to steady her breath, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Then a sudden clang. Her chair shifted slightly, and the edge of her jacket slipped from her lap to the floor. The room stilled for just a fraction of a second as a corner of the ribbon caught the candlelight. The rich blue gleamed in the soft glow, a shard of truth piercing through the carefully spun lies of dismissal and disdain. No one spoke. The glint was fleeting, almost easy to miss. But Sophie's eyes caught it. Her lips parted, recognition dawning in the innocence of her stare. Emily reached down quickly, pulling the jacket back into place, her heart thundering. But the damage was done. The metal's whisper had entered the room, whether the others chose to hear it yet or not. Secrets can only stay hidden so long before they demand air. The house had settled into that peculiar haze of late evening, when wine softened voices and loosened restraint. Half the family lingered in the living room, slouched in armchairs or sprawled on couches, glasses still in hand. Bradley spoke louder than necessary, his cheeks flushed, his laugh too frequent. Darren matched him drink for drink, tossing his head back, as if trying to outshine even the fireplace with his bluster. Margaret sat stiff, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes following Emily with a gaze sharp enough to slice. Richard, however, remained steady. He sat apart, posture straight, hands loosely gripping a glass of water instead of champagne. His eyes tracked every movement with quiet vigilance. Sophie nestled beside him, her head tilted as she watched her aunt with curiosity that cut through the fog of adult dismissal. Emily adjusted her coat, pulling it tighter around herself as if the fabric could shield her from the weight of their judgment. But the movement betrayed her. The velvet blue case, long hidden in the inner fold, slipped forward, teetering against the edge of her pocket. Richard's eyes widened instantly, a recognition sparking there that only someone who had studied history and valor could carry. His hand twitched as if he wanted to rise, to protect the object before it was exposed. But he stayed seated, knowing the moment wasn't his to claim. Sophie leaned closer, her voice a whisper that sliced through the chatter. "Is that what I think it is?" Emily glanced down, her fingers pressing the coat flat, but the faint shimmer of the case had already betrayed her. She gave Sophie the smallest nod, a silent pact between them. The girl's eyes grew, reflecting awe rather than scorn, the kind of awe Emily had almost forgotten existed. But Darren noticed the exchange. His eyes narrowed, curiosity tinged with mockery. "What's this?" he said with a drunken grin, lurching forward. "Hiding love letters, Em? Or maybe some overdue bills?" His hand reached toward her jacket in a gesture that pretended at playfulness but dripped with malice. Emily jerked back, but his fingers snagged the fabric. "Darren? Stop!" she said, her voice low, but firm. The others chuckled, mistaking his cruelty for humor. Bradley's laugh rang loudest. Margaret's lips curved in satisfaction, as if her son's taunts validated her judgment. Richard's voice broke through, sharper than expected. "Enough." It was the first word he had spoken with force all evening, but Darren ignored him, tugging harder. Emily's pulse raced, the memory of firefights roaring against the present. Her instinct to wrest back control battled with her need for restraint. "Let go," she hissed, her hand pressing firmly against the inside of her coat. And then it happened. The velvet blue case slipped free, sliding out of her pocket with a weight that defied silence. It hit the carpet with a soft thud, but the sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot. Conversation stopped. Glasses hovered midair. The flickering light of the fire caught the polished surface of the box, casting a subtle gleam that no one could ignore. For a moment, no one moved. Even Darren, smirk still half-formed, froze as the realization of what he had uncovered began to dawn. Emily stared at the case on the floor, her breath steady but her heart hammering. She hadn't wanted this, not yet, not like this. But secrets had their own timing, and the velvet blue had finally demanded air. The truth doesn't knock, it crashes the door down. The case lay on the carpet, its velvet skin shimmering faintly under the glow of half-burned candles. Nobody moved at first. The air was thick, charged with the weight of something irreversible. Then, almost as if by fate, the box flipped open with a soft snap, and the Medal of Honor spilled its brilliance into the room. The silver star, cradled by its sky-blue ribbon, reflected the flicker of candlelight, a sacred gleam in a profane space. Richard was the first to find his voice. He leaned forward, eyes wide, reverence overtaking shock. "My God, Emily." His whisper carried across the silence, louder than any shout. Bradley's glass clinked against the table, his hand trembling though he tried to hide it. Darren, however, laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that scraped against the room's hush. "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "You expect us to believe this? A Medal of Honor just lying around in your pocket? You probably bought it online. People sell fakes all the time." The sneer twisted his face, but it no longer landed as easily as before. Sophie gasped, edging closer to the medal, her small fingers twitching as if drawn to touch history itself. Emily rose slowly, the weight of every scar and memory pressing into her spine, yet forcing her taller, steadier. She fixed her gaze on Darren, then on Margaret, whose lips pressed into a bloodless line. Her voice came low at first, carrying both steel and sorrow. Do you think I wanted this? She stooped, lifting the metal with both hands, careful as if it were still burning from the forge. She held it before them, the ribbon cascading, the star catching firelight. This isn't some trinket. This isn't for show. This is Mason's blood and mine, and the weight of every scream I still hear when I close my eyes. The room shifted. Bradley stopped smirking. Even Darren's bravado faltered for a fraction of a second. Emily inhaled, steadying herself. Durez Zor. 2017. Mortars raining on us. Night sky tearing open. Mason took the hit that was meant for me. He knew I would keep dragging the others out. He said, "You'll live. For us." And I did. I carried them through fire while Mason bled into the sand. They gave me this medal, but it's his. It will always be his. The crackle of the fire seemed to dim, as though it, too, was listening. The only sound afterward was the faint clink of Richard setting his glass down. He leaned forward, voice firm, almost reverent. "I've seen one before. Arlington, years ago. There's no mistaking it. This is real." He looked around the room, challenging anyone to contradict him. "Emily earned it, whether you want to admit it or not." Margaret's composure began to fracture. Her face drained of color, lips trembling as though she'd swallowed poison. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Emily turned her eyes to her mother, voice sharp now, the tremor replaced with precision. "You wrote about me once, remember? Sometimes the ghost you chased was sitting at your own table." The house had grown colder since the medal was revealed, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the truth. The family trailed Emily into the library, their footsteps hesitant, murmurs thick as smoke. Shelves of forgotten books and dust-laden journals lined the walls, guardians of secrets too long ignored. Emily's eyes searched until they found it the framed article, tucked between cracked volumes and family photos. Yellowed paper, her mother's byline in bold at the top. She lifted it carefully, the glass cool against her palm. Turning toward the cluster of faces, she spoke, her voice unwavering though the tremor of old wounds hummed beneath. "Do you remember writing this, Mother?" She held the frame high so the candlelight caught the faded ink. The ghost commander who risked everything for her comrades. A hero without a name. An enigma you said deserved the world's respect. Margaret's lips parted, confusion shadowing her face. Emily's voice sharpened. "That was me. You wrote this about me, your daughter, and you didn't even know." The words struck harder than any fist. Sophie's eyes went wide, darting between grandmother and aunt as though she were watching pillars crack. Richard exhaled slowly, his silence carrying the weight of silent agreement. Emily lowered her gaze briefly to the article, then read aloud, her tone measured yet laced with fire. "The Ghost Commander, a soldier who pulled comrades from the jaws of death under fire, who carried more than his body could bear, whose courage might one day be known." She paused, then looked directly at Margaret. "And now you mock me, you diminish me, you erase me from our family's story." Margaret stammered, words colliding, voice brittle. I didn't know. I thought it was some anonymous account. How could I have known it was you?" Emily stepped closer, her shadow falling across her mother's trembling hands. "Because you never asked. Because you didn't want to see me. The ghost you praised was easier to love than the daughter who came home broken." Gasps stirred among the others. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. Darren's smirk had long since evaporated. Even Aunt Linda, usually impervious, folded her arms as if bracing against the storm. Margaret tried again, desperation seeping into her voice. "I celebrated that soldier. I celebrated." Emily cut her off, the frame trembling slightly in her grip. "You celebrated me when I was nameless. You betrayed me the moment I was your daughter again." Her voice cracked into steel. "You betrayed me then, and you betray me now." The silence afterward was a canyon, wide and merciless. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes shimmering with the dawning horror of recognition. She pressed a hand to her lips, but no excuse could climb past her throat. And Emily stood there, holding the article like a mirror, forcing her mother and the entire family to see what they had refused to acknowledge. That the ghost they revered had been seated at their table all along, bleeding silently in their midst. Every empire crumbles when the lies run out. The dining hall had lost its warmth. Hours earlier, champagne glasses clinked in shallow toasts. Laughter rang false across the polished table. Now the glasses sat untouched, their bubbles long dead, the air heavy with the echo of what Emily had unearthed. The family, once so sure of its hierarchy, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if the floor beneath them was no longer stable. Bradley was the first to crack. His usual smug grin was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. He cleared his throat but found no words. Darren, who had mocked Emily at every turn, muttered something under his breath and leaned back, arms crossed, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously to the metal lying between Emily's fingers, gleaming even in the dim light. For once, he had no joke sharp enough to cover his humiliation. Emily remained standing, calm, collected, though every heartbeat in her chest carried years of pain and silence. She did not need to shout. The metal itself spoke louder than any voice. Richard, long relegated to the role of silent shadow, finally broke his chains. He pushed back his chair, the scrape ringing like a declaration. His voice, gravelly but firm, cut through the room. "I should have stood by you long ago." He met Emily's eyes, not with pity, but with recognition. "Forgive me for my silence." The words startled everyone. Margaret's head snapped toward him, fury sparking in her glare. "Richard, don't!" she hissed, desperate to grasp at the authority slipping from her fingers. But her voice trembled, and the tremor betrayed her. No one listened. The tide had shifted. The cousins exchanged glances, shame creeping across their faces as the weight of their ridicule turned back on them. The whispers began not loud, but steady, circling Margaret like vultures. "She wrote the article, didn't she?" one muttered. "Praised her own daughter, then tried to erase her," another added. Hypocrisy unmasked, and the cracks spread quickly. Margaret rose, clutching at the tablecloth as though it could anchor her. "You don't understand, this family needs order. Respect. If you tear it apart—" Her words fell into silence. Nobody rallied to her side. Authority, once unquestioned, dissolved in the face of her exposed duplicity. Emily stepped forward, placing the medal at the center of the table. It glimmered under the chandelier, no longer a secret but a symbol. She fixed her eyes on her mother, her voice steady, resolute. "This isn't about money anymore." The room froze, every gaze locked on the star between them. Margaret's empire had collapsed, its foundation of lies shattered, and Emily now held the ground beneath them all. Victory tastes bitter when it costs everything. The house was still when dawn crept in, its light spilling through the kitchen curtains in pale ribbons. The clatter of the long, hostile dinner was over, but its echoes lingered in the silence, woven into the walls. Emily sat at the table, her jacket folded neatly beside her, the medal tucked within its velvet case once more. She sipped at a lukewarm cup of coffee, not for taste, but to keep her hands from shaking. Richard entered slowly, shoulders stooped as though the night had added decades to his frame. He hesitated before sitting across from her, searching her face with guilt carved deep into his eyes. "I should have spoken sooner," he admitted, his voice low, brittle. "All these years I stood by and let them diminish you. My silence, it was my greatest failure." He bowed his head, his hands trembling against the tabletop. Emily studied him for a long moment. She wanted to rage, to demand why he hadn't shielded her when she needed it most. Instead, she found herself strangely calm, as if exhaustion had wrung the anger out of her. "You can't rewrite the years, Dad," she said quietly, "but you can stop pretending that silence is love." Before Richard could respond, Sophie padded into the kitchen, her hair a sleepy tangle, her small hands rubbing at her eyes. She climbed onto Emily's lap without hesitation, wrapping her arms tight around her neck. "You're the only hero I know," Sophie whispered, her words soft but firm, untainted by the cynicism of the adults. The sincerity struck Emily harder than any accusation could. She pressed a kiss to Sophie's hair, holding her close, feeling for the first time that night that someone truly saw her. Behind them, Margaret hovered in the doorway. The formidable matriarch who once ruled the family table now looked diminished, her features hollow in the pale light. Her voice broke as she spoke, the words more confession than excuse. "I never knew how to love you." The statement hung heavy, a surrender laced with regret. Emily turned her head, her gaze steady, unsparing. "Then don't start now," she replied softly, each word sharp enough to sever the final tie. There was no venom in her tone, only truth cold, irrevocable. Margaret flinched as if struck, retreating back into the shadows without another word. The kitchen fell silent again. Richard stayed still, hands clasped as though in prayer, while Sophie clung to Emily like a lifeline. After a moment, Emily gently lifted Sophie onto the chair beside her and reached for the velvet blue case. She slid it into her pocket with deliberate care, its weight both a burden and a reminder. She rose, her footsteps echoing faintly on the tiled floor, and glanced once around the kitchen, the last room of a house that had never truly been home. She wasn't leaving in anger, nor in triumph. She was leaving because dignity demanded it. Emily pocketed the medal, preparing to leave the house forever. Justice doesn't roar, it lingers like a shadow. The front porch creaked beneath Emily's boots as she stepped into the pale light of morning. Frost stretched across the lawn in delicate veins, catching the first glow of the sun. Her breath clouded in the cold, dissipating quickly into the quiet air. Behind her, the house loomed heavy with memories, its walls echoing with arguments, betrayals, and the long nights unraveling. She didn't look back. Some places were not meant to be revisited. The medal was hidden beneath her coat, pressed against her heart, its weight both an anchor and a reminder. She touched it lightly through the fabric, a silent gesture, as though grounding herself before she crossed the threshold of her past. The velvet case, cool against her ribs, carried more than metal. It carried names, faces, promises that no estate or inheritance could ever replace. She whispered into the crisp air, her voice almost carried away by the wind. For us, Mason's words breathed on a battlefield years ago, now returned as a vow renewed. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the crackle of distant gunfire only in memory, the fading cries of men she once saved, and the silence of the one she couldn't. Richard lingered at the doorway, his hand gripping the frame as though it might hold him upright. His face was marked by remorse and something new respect. He wanted to say more, to plead for forgiveness or at least understanding, but Emily stopped him with a single glance. She turned her head slightly, the faintest edge of warmth cutting through her weariness. "Don't toast me," she said quietly, her tone resolute. "Toast the ones who never came home." The word struck him deeper than reproach could. Richard lowered his eyes, nodding slowly, as though promising he would remember. Sophie had slipped to his side, her small frame dwarfed by his, her wide eyes following Emily's every step. She pressed herself close to her grandfather, gripping his hand as though afraid Emily might vanish completely if she let go. The frost cracked beneath Emily's boots as she moved down the steps, her figure bathed in the pale orange of dawn. The air was sharp, invigorating, each breath cutting like glass, yet filling her lungs with a strange freedom. She did not stride with triumph nor stumble with defeat. She walked steady, carrying her scars like armor, her silhouette strong, solitary, unbroken. Sophie's voice broke the silence, fragile but urgent. "Will she ever come back?" she asked, her words trembling in the early chill. Richard's reply came after a long pause, his gaze fixed on Emily's shrinking figure, the horizon swallowing her step by step. "Only if she wants to," he said, his voice low but certain. The answer was both a truth and a surrender. Emily's life was hers to command now, not theirs to define. From the upstairs window, hidden behind the lace curtains, Margaret watched in silence. Her hands gripped the fabric tightly, her face pale in the gray morning light. She said nothing, did nothing, only let the vision of her daughter's back imprint itself as a wound she would carry quietly. Emily kept walking until the house was just another shape behind her, fading into the frost. Ahead lay nothing certain, nothing promised, but also nothing binding her to the chain she had finally broken. Justice had not shouted, had not brought cheers or applause. It lingered instead, quiet as a shadow, steady as the dawn. And with each step, Emily carried it forward alone, but free. The night of betrayal gave way to a dawn where truth stood unshaken, and the weight of silence finally shifted toward justice. What began as humiliation ended with revelation, stripping power from the deceitful and returning dignity to the one they cast aside. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime, reminding us that lies eventually collapse, but truth endures. Like ashes carried by the wind, the pain remains, yet so does the lesson. No empire of cruelty lasts forever. If this story moved you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Drop a 1 if you felt the same fire for justice, or a 2 if you felt something was missing.